Welcome to Brain in a Vat. We are delighted to be joined by Perry Hendricks, and we're going to be speaking about abortion. Perry, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with two thought experiments. So the first thought experiment is this. Suppose that Sally goes to a bar and drinks a whole lot of alcohol, and then she drives home drunk, hits somebody on the way home and kills them, but she makes it home safely. No one finds out. Same night, another woman, Samantha, went to a bar, drank a lot of alcohol, got really drunk, and went home and drove safely home without killing anyone. Now, my contention here is that even though neither person got caught doing something that was wrong, it's much better to be the second driver than the first driver. The first driver killed somebody, and that's a very bad thing. So it's much better for somebody to be prevented from killing another person or doing something wrong in general. Okay, that's the first one. Here's the second one. Now, suppose for the sake of argument that abortion is wrong. It involves some kind of unjust killing of the fetus. If that's the case, then it seems like having abortions be restricted is going to be a good thing for women because it's going to prevent them from doing something wrong in much the same way that someone who is prevented from driving home drunk is prevented from doing something wrong. It's beneficial to the person. And if that's the case, it looks like abortion restrictions are actually particularly good for Black women because Black women get abortions at disproportionate rates in the US.
So I take it the initial objection a lot of people will have will be an external coherence objection. So they're going to disagree with some of your sort of background assumptions, which would be that abortion's wrong. So I'm not sure if you have some original take on why you think abortion's wrong that's relevant to this position, or if it's just sort of let's assume that it's wrong and then see what follows.
Well, I do have reasons I think abortion is wrong, but for this, what I want to show is that if it is wrong, then it turns out that abortion restrictions are good. And the upshot of this is that there's a lot of articles written on how abortion restrictions are bad for women, and they're particularly bad for Black women. But this kind of is supposed to show that we need to take into account all of this other factor, which is the ethics of abortion. And once we do that, it's going to follow, or at least arguably follow, that abortion restrictions turn out to actually be good for women. And so we can't really get outside the ethics of abortion. Or rather, we have to start with the ethics of abortion before we can talk about whether abortion restrictions are beneficial or harmful to women.
So I wonder about whether it is the case that it's always good for the individual performing a wrong to be prevented from performing the wrong. So if we look at your example, it's very clearly good for the potential accident victim if the drunk driver is prevented from driving, because that saves that victim. It would be good for that person if they were going to be prosecuted for it. But let's say you're the kind of person who really enjoys doing immoral things. So you deliberately get drunk so that you can run people over. And you're very good at hiding it. It's very bad for all those people. But you might say, well, I am better off. I had a good time mowing down those people or killing those kids or whatever the bad thing is. I never got caught, so I never suffered any setback to my interests. How have I been harmed? I would be harmed if someone came in and they took away the gun or the knife or the keys, because then I wouldn't be able to act in accordance with my will. But doing all those things is really good for me.
Yeah, so in that case, you're satisfying a lot of your desires and you're feeling pretty good. And I think that's true that you can, feel pretty good. But I think there's a difference between feeling like you're living a good life and actually living a good life. So if we were to go and write, we had this person's story about what they did and just a description of all the things they did in their life versus somebody who didn't do those things. I think we want to say the other life was better, even though that person even maybe had more subjective satisfaction. So they were very happy, personally had lots of nice mental states. I think that the other person's life is still better.
So if I understand correctly, you hold that whether someone's life is going well has an objective answer rather than a subjective answer. We don't look at the pleasure or pain or desire satisfaction in that person's life. We look at whether their life comports with a list of objective goods. So are they living a moral life? Check. And maybe a whole bunch of other goods on that list. So is that an accurate characterization of your account of well-being?
Yeah.
Okay. So now people could take issue there, which is another external coherence issue, right? So they could say, look, I have a different version of what makes a person's life go well. It's more of a subjectivist account or an interest-based account or something like that, in which case it wouldn't go through your argument. But let's assume that objectless theory is the case. It may still be the case that a person's life goes best overall on an object-list account of well-being if they perform immoral actions. So it could be the case that other values outweigh morality some of the time. So, a good example is Susan Wolf's Moral Saint. Susan Wolf's Moral Saint does the right thing all the time. So they always do the right thing to the greatest degree at all times. They're perfectly moral. But that person misses out on a lot of other values in their life. That person can't go and learn how to play tennis, for example, because while they're learning how to play tennis, they could be feeding the poor. They can't read a Dostoevsky novel because while they're reading that Dostoevsky novel, they could be teaching children how to read. So that person, according to Susan Wolf, that person's life does not go well. So it could still be the case that abortion is wrong and that wrongness diminishes the goodness in your life, but maybe at the cost of some other good being sacrificed if you were not to do it. So in other words, there could be other goods that outweigh morality, so you can still do immoral things. So it doesn't necessarily follow that just because you're preventing an immoral action, you're making the person's life go better.
Right. So in the saint case, we have a person who isn't really, they're doing everything they ought to do. And then there's some other values they miss out on. But if we think about cases in which, you end up killing somebody unjustly, which we're assuming is the case here, that's a pretty serious thing to do. A little more than refraining from teaching children to read or reading Dostoevsky, which, I wouldn't recommend that in general. Like, if the book's so good, why haven't they made a movie? And I want to grant that there are going to be cases in which we can certainly concoct some cases in which it's going to be better for an individual if they did some harmful act. Like, maybe you'd think like Hitler's mom had an abortion or something like that. So there are going to be cases, but we can talk about overall for the group of women that prevents a large, who would have abortions, that prevents a substantial amount of bad things from happening, and very bad things at that. And then for your average person who would be restricted from getting an abortion, it's going to be possible to outweigh it in some cases, but I suspect in your typical case, being prevented from killing somebody unjustly is going to be a massive benefit that will rarely be outweighed by whatever benefits you would get from killing the person and making your life go better.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that what you're doing is you're pigeonholing yourself into a very specific set of positions. So you've got, firstly, the claim that abortion is wrong. Then you've got the claim that objectless good theory is the way to understand well-being. But now you've got a third assumption, which is that it's not just wrong to abort, it's very wrong. It's an extreme wrong. It's equivalent to killing someone unjustly. That pushes you even further into a set of positions which, of course, some people hold, but it's now becoming a very niche position. And a lot of people might agree that it's wrong to abort, but they might think it's only a little bit wrong. So they might think that there's a balance of factors involved. Sometimes aborting means that child's not going to live a very difficult life, for example. So maybe that child was going to be raised into poverty or into a very difficult home life, or maybe the mother was raped and there's a whole bunch of other factors involved. In other words, there are countervailing questions. There's weightings on each side, which might make the abortion only a little bit wrong. And so by holding this position, you're pigeonholing not just the people who will agree with you into a very small subset of people, but also it might only pertain to a very small subset of actual abortions, the ones that are very wrong.
Right. So, yeah, what I think about this is that if we're thinking about the ethics of abortion, the typical pro-life view is that abortion isn't just this smidgen wrong, right? It's a very significant wrong. And so that's the position I'm saying, that if we want to think about whether these abortion restrictions are good or bad, we have to be able to sort of settle that issue first. And so it's true that, I think it's maybe 20% in the most recent Phil Papers or Phil People survey. I think it was a little bit below 20%. Maybe of philosophers thought that early abortion is wrong. So it's a small percentage already of philosophers who think that. But I guess the point here is that until we settle whether that view is actually correct or not, we can't really say whether these restrictions are good or bad. And so we need to look at the arguments for that and decide that we can't bypass it and just say that restrictions are bad for women and particularly bad for Black women. We got to address the ethics first.
So it seems like you've got to do the counterfactual. So if we're trying to, even if we're on an objective lists case, say, what would your life look like if you were compelled not to have the abortion? So that's the sort of scenario, and you can imagine the financial costs associated with raising the child, the restrictions on your autonomy, possibly the restrictions on meeting a life partner if, let's say, you were single when you got impregnated. So it could have a whole bunch of things that are objectively quite bad for you, and maybe some good things as well, like you get to look after the child, you form a loving relationship with them. But if we're not looking at the subjective interest of that person, and we're just looking at what's good for them from this perspective of the universe, it seems like you've got to look at the other side of the accounting exercise, and so that might be quite fact specific, and so you might not be able to say in all circumstances that it's good for the person to be prevented from doing it, even if abortion is wrong, and maybe even if it's very wrong.
Yeah, so let me first make a weakened conclusion here, and then I'm going to respond to that and see if I can alleviate some of your worries there. So the weakened conclusion would say this: okay, fine, that's true, but then we still can't say abortion restrictions are bad for women. What we have to say is, we don't know whether they are. It's a hard calculus to make. We got to add up all these things that are hard to add up, hard to identify, hard to weigh, and so we just don't know. And that's a significant conclusion in itself, I think. But we also might just say, well, typically when we're thinking about these bads that one incurs or these burdens one incurs from having children, they don't outweigh the good that would come from being prevented from having abortion. So this idea isn't original to me, but kids are pretty awesome. I didn't come up with that, but kids are cool. It's fun to have a family. I got 4 of them. They make it so that you get less sleep. They cost you significant amount of money and time. But, it's they bring a lot of benefits as well. It's good to have a relationship with children, as a family. It's good to watch them develop and flourish. And it's good to have a mini you or several mini yous going around, at least if you aren't a bummer to be around. It's a good thing. So I think there are a lot of goods that come from having kids that would need to be counterweighed there. And then also, so it's true that parents typically report lower levels of happiness than those who don't have children, but it's not by a whole lot. It's not by a significant amount at all. It's actually single people report the lowest amounts of happiness. So I don't think it's taking much of a hit that parents do lose some satisfaction or something like that. And then lastly, there was a study, the Turnaway study found that something like 96% of women who were denied an abortion were actually happy about being denied an abortion after 5 years. So the vast majority of women who are denied an abortion turn out to be all right with that choice.
So a couple of thoughts. The first is, I assume that you're happy to have your 4 kids because you decided to have them. Now, you like having children, and so you're going to be the kind of person who's happy to raise children. And imagine that the state said, well, you're a great dad. And so there's these moms who don't really want to raise their kids. So instead of them having the abortions, we're just going to give you the kids and you look after them. And we keep adding kids. I imagine at some point you think my life has now gotten worse. My bank balance is looking a lot smaller. These aren't mini me's. Some of them bring me some joy, but I'm forced into raising these little terrors who are tearing up my house all the time and beating up my other biological kids. At some point, you're going to say, I'm worse off. Now, it seems kind of important, I would think, that you get to play a role in deciding that. That one of the things that might upset you so much about the state forcing you to have these kids in your house is that you didn't get to choose it. You chose to be a foster dad. You'd say, great, I want these kids around. But being forced to have them might be reducing your objective lists in the world. And so I think it's a disanalogy to say having kids is great. Having kids that you want is great. Having kids that are forced upon you might be a lot less great.
Yeah. So I think that you can tally up being unable to have an abortion when you want one. That's kind of something that would frustrate you, put you a little worse off or something like that. But like that stat that I just cited, the Turnaway study suggests that this is very rare to happen. It's that the vast majority of women, at least according to that study, are not remorseful when they're denied their abortions after several years. So that doesn't seem to happen very often. And so we could still say at the group level, it's beneficial for women and particularly for Black women to be prevented from having abortions, though there will be exceptions at the individual level. Although even in that case, like, it seems to me that all the goodness that comes from having a kid is probably going to outweigh it. But it's true that there will be some fringe cases, I think.
So I have a question for you. Suppose there was a bill that was floated, and the bill said that we're going to prevent Black women specifically, no other group, no other racial group of women, Black women specifically from having abortions. Do you think that is a bill that we should support?
No, that would I don't think so. Why not expand the bill?
Let's just assume that's not an option. So it's between Black women and nobody. So either everyone can have abortions, or we can just prevent Black women from having abortions. That's what the bill suggests. On your reasoning, we should support the bill, which is, as you say, absurd, right?
Well, I did not say absurd, but my face might have said it. But if those are really our only two options, then I suppose we should support it. In fact, for those, equity is all the rage these days, and so we'd have this large benefit going to Black women, and so you'd have equity-based rounds for supporting that.
But I take it that when you were laughing, it was because it seems like it would be a particularly egregious wrong towards Black women, not a benefit. That's not the reason it's wrong because we're giving an increased benefit to Black women. It's because we're depriving them of a freedom.
So I don't think that's why I think it's undesirable. But one reason is when it's put that way, it sounds like the people who are putting forth the bill and designing it are perhaps racist, and that's a bad thing. And I wouldn't want to get behind racist people who are doing something like that. So that's why I would find it undesirable.
Well, there's a lot of, as you say, there's like a lot of equity bills that float around, at least in South Africa, where previously disadvantaged groups, previously oppressed groups are accrued certain advantages. I take it that no politician would want to float this bill as a way to redress disadvantages of the past, because it seems like it would hurt rather than help Black women, specifically because it increases restriction. And that itself seems to make a life go poorly.
Right. So in that case, I imagine the reason, if you're trying to address past issues, a big part of it is going to be financial. And a problem with having kids is that it requires you to spend a lot of money and time. It makes it harder to work. So if that's what you're trying to address, and you only get one bill to put up there that you can have, you would want it to be one that somehow benefits them financially. So that's why I would, and I mean, there's other reasons that no politician would ever get that passed for a million reasons. But if they're trying to address some kind of financial inequity, then the abortion restrictions wouldn't address that. So you'd want a different bill. So that's why I would think that would be an odd bill to fix
Okay,
there.
that's a nice concession though, because now suddenly something Mark said earlier starts to gain a bit more weight. So something Mark said earlier is that having children can have negative consequences, and specifically it costs a lot of money to raise them. It seems that forcing women to have children that they're impregnated with against their will, whether it be against their will or not, forcing them to have those children would result in a worse financial state of affairs for them. That is at least one countervailing reason that you've now admitted is a countervailing value, which is hurting those who are not allowed to abort.
Well, I think that what causes the financial hurt is actually if you were forced to raise them, not necessarily forced to have them. So what I've said is consistent with, women being able to put up their children for adoption. So you can avoid the cost in that way.
Yeah, so let's play with that version of it. So you've got the politicians who say Black women are the most marginal group in society, and they are deserving of our greatest consideration. That we think it's important that Black women are able to live their best possible lives, virtuous lives, ones that comport with objective lists. Other people seem to be doing okay on that front, so we can have legislation that targets particular groups. So this is really for the benefit of Black women only, unlike those other groups that don't require the benefit. And we'll take a couple of things out of it. So you can't get an abortion, but we'll cover the costs of having the child, and we won't require you to raise the child. You will have an election to put it up in an adoption system, and other people can raise your child, whether they're Black, white, or whatever it is. But we still have the targeted legislation that confers the benefit on them. I've taken out some of the other downsides. Are we now happy? Are you going to support the bill?
So am I going to float the bill? It's either that or nothing.
Yeah, we either have racial justice or no justice. What kind of a bigot are you?
I mean, that would be a step towards racial justice. It's not a financial one. So when people think about these things, they're typically thinking financial. But if you broaden the scope here and note that there are better ways, not being prevented from from unjustly killing somebody is definitely a benefit. It's better for you. Once you see that, I think everyone should sign up for that.
I mean, it's a very bold position, Perry, and I love bold positions. I want to provide a less spicy objection back to your account of object goods as comprising someone's well-being. It just seems counterintuitive to say that preventing someone from doing something immoral necessarily, at least if it's a highly immoral action, makes their life go better. It seems like intuitively, if we think pre-philosophically here, it seems intuitively that the very reason why morality is an important value is to persuade us to do things that are not always good for us. Morality seems to pull away from what is good for us in many instances. And especially in those cases where the thing that we want to do is very wrong. Cheating is a good example. It just seems really good for the person who cheats if they're never found out to cheat. Let's say they can cheat and really enjoy the experience. That just seems really good for them. But it's really going to hurt someone else if it's found out. And, it's wrong for that reason and they shouldn't do so. But to say that they shouldn't do it because it's bad for them seems to not capture something we know about the nature of actions that we want to perform that will feel good for us and that we even want the outcomes. But they're just not the kind of actions that moral people should perform.
Okay. Yeah, good point. So first, I want to say that this isn't this won't necessarily be the case. Like I was saying earlier, there are going to be some cases in which someone's life could go better if they do something significantly wrong. Probably lots of cases, depending on which wrong we're talking about. But in the case of killing somebody unjustly, there are probably going to be some cases. And then I also don't want to say that the reason you shouldn't do these, like the reason you shouldn't cheat is because it's bad for you. That's not what I want to say. There are lots of reasons you shouldn't cheat, but one of them we can say is this reason, that it's good for you to not do this bad thing. But there are going to be other, perhaps stronger reasons for you not to do it, but there'll be multiple. And then, yeah, I agree. Like in the case of cheating, it's going to hurt your practical interests, if you are, if you don't do it. But, the thing about morality, that annoying thing about it is it can be pretty demanding. So I agree that it'll mess with your practical interests. I'm just not sure I see that as, like, I suppose that is one downside, but it's not going to outweigh the benefit to yourself there.
So I want to address two things. The one is, you mentioned an empirical study earlier where women who are prevented from having an abortion after 5 years are asked, do you regret this? And most say no, and that large proportion say no. It might be because they can't do the counterfactual very well. They've got a 5-year-old child, and what you're asking them is, do you wish your child was dead? And 90% of them will say no. But that's not really the situation they would have been in. It's that child would never have been brought into existence. But it's quite hard to imagine that. I think some women who have kids and, let's say, didn't consider an abortion might say, when they look at their single friends who have a lot of personal freedom, I wish I didn't have children. I could have, led this glorious life, and I could have traveled, and I could have had a bigger boat. But I don't want my kid to be dead. I love my kid. But they can imagine this other life to an extent. But I think very few people are able to do that. The other one is to look at another empirical study, the one made famous in Freakonomics, which is that abortions seem linked to another benefit, which is mass reduction in crime. So the argument is something like, if you were the kind of person who would have had an abortion and were prevented from doing so, those kids grew up in a home where their parents didn't want them. They may have been poorer, and those kids, may have resorted to a life of crime. But because those parents were able to have their abortion, those kids never pop into existence, and so they never play a role in the criminal network. And the argument in the original paper was it's played a significant role, and then they revisited it 20 years later, and they said, turns out we're right. The data supports us. So it might very well be that it is good for you to be prevented from the abortion, but it might be very bad for everybody else because we've got these negative externalities from your existence. And furthermore, if you're an antinatalist like David Benatar, you're going to say it was also bad for the child to be brought into existence. That it would be better for them to have been aborted at the right stage.
Okay, so let's take the first point about maybe it's really hard to weigh the counterfactual, right? If you have a 5-year-old child, you're trying to decide which life is better. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. There also might be some social desirability bias coming into play for why someone who has a child would want to say that. But let's stick with the point that it's the issue that it's really hard to tell what's better. Well, if that's the case, then a point you were making earlier, that these frustration of these interests that you have towards wanting to not have a kid and wanting to pursue these other things, that becomes a whole lot harder to judge there, because we can't really tell whether it's going better, which the mother would like more, having the child or not having the child. And if that's the case, we can go back to the weaker thesis, which is that, well, it's really hard to tell whether abortion restrictions are good or bad for women and Black women, and so we should be agnostic. And then with crime, so yeah, it's if it's true that having less access to abortion increases crime, that's going to be a bad thing. But it still might, nevertheless be good for women to be prevented from having abortions, even if there is this other factor that comes into play, like a rise in crime. To weigh them, we need to know what types of crime rose, who they affected. And I mean, those are issues that can be addressed with other things as well. Perhaps there might be other issues, that ways to address crime than having abortions. If we want to lower crime, it might be an odd strategy to encourage abortions, but I can see that might be one negative factor that you can take into account. I'm just not sure it outweighs the positive one of being prevented from doing something that's significantly wrong.
Maybe there's also an issue around weighing political goods versus individual goods. And you might be pulling in opposite directions here. So I take it that paternalism is generally bad. That's an intuition I hold. So making someone do something or not do something because doing that thing or not doing that thing would be good for them feels to me very it really grates me the wrong way. Like it feels wrong. It feels like there's a political injustice that's happening, even if it results in me living a better life. And so perhaps one way to object to your view is to say, yes, maybe it is true that it is the case that it is wrong to abort, and maybe it is true that a person's life goes better if they're prevented from aborting. But the very act of forcing them to do something that is good for them that they don't want to do, or not do something that they do want to do, is a form of paternalism that suggests political illegitimacy. And that is a countervailing value, even if it doesn't affect that person's well being.
I'm a little bit suspicious about this because it seems to me that it might you might be committed to the view that we shouldn't coerce people into not killing other people. Right? I assume you're fine with that kind of coercion, but if that's the case and you think that kind of paternalism is okay, and we think that abortion is this unjust killing, and it seems like it should apply in that case as well, that it's okay to apply that kind of coercion.
Well, I think that you could offer a very different reason for why you prevent people from killing other people. And that would be that those people that are being killed are citizens of your state, and you have a duty as the state to prevent harm coming to them. Now, then there's an interesting question whether that very principle can be used to protect unborn children. Are they citizens of the state? Is the state obligated to prevent their deaths? If you say yes, they are citizens of the state, you're going to have a very interesting account of citizenship that I think a lot of people would find difficult and unpalatable. What I'm trying to do here, Perry, is to pigeonhole you into such a niche philosophical set of positions that almost no philosopher would hold the combination of all of them. So that, yes, your view is deductively valid if you hold all the positions, but nobody holds all the positions, and so nobody would hold your conclusion.
Well, that's very rude of you. Um, so the way that I think about what we can coerce people to do, I'm skeptical of state authority. So I don't see significance in citizenship. I just don't care about that. You know, suppose somebody walks across your border and they're not a citizen, you can't just shoot them in the head, right? That's a bad thing. But if we think that the pro-life view is correct, then it seems like similar considerations might apply here. Or if we just want to, we could just get the state to declare that all unborn children are in fact citizens. You know, so yeah, I don't think that citizenship can do much work here, at least for those of us who are skeptical of government authority in the first place and don't ascribe much value to it.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't buy into citizenship as a relevant moral factor, we can replace the word citizenship with a protected being under the state. So that being is protected under the state because they're traveling there, for example, not just because they're a citizen. They've been issued a visa and they're allowed in the country. Maybe the state has an agreement with another state to allow them into the country, and so they're allowed into the country, and because of that, the state which is hosting them awards them with some value, and it's often not as high a value as the citizens of that state. But do you think that is the right way of understanding an unborn child? That unborn child doesn't have an ID number yet, which we give at birth in South Africa. That child hasn't been registered by the state. They have no record. It just seems odd to think that the state is obligated to give that unborn being, even if it is a person, any kind of moral status or protection.
So I mean, if the pro-life view is correct, why not think of unborn children as these people who are crossing the border but not, a citizen. Why not think of it that way? That seems like probably the right view to take if you care about citizenship and also think that the pro-life view is correct. But I mean, the way that I think about this is like, what can a government coerce people into doing? And then I think that if I can do it, it's at least somewhat plausible. Well, let's put it this way. If I can't do it, then the government can't coerce someone into doing it either. I don't ascribe them any special authority. And when I think about cases in which I can coerce people, it's like, yeah, I can prevent somebody from murdering someone murdering someone else, whether they're a citizen or not. And I can coerce somebody into saving a drowning child if I'm wheelchair bound. So I think in this case, I could coerce somebody to not having an abortion. Or let's put it this way: suppose that like you're, a woman's, unbeknownst to her, pregnant. She's on a hike out in the woods, and she goes into labor. She's 8 or 9 months pregnant and didn't even know she was pregnant. Right? That occasionally happens. She gives birth in the cabin, and the baby is just fine, but she's snowed in there. She's going to be stuck there for a few weeks. The only problem is that while there's a lot of food that adults can consume in the cabin, there's no formula in the cabin. Now, the only way for the child to survive is if the woman breastfeeds the child. So it seems to me that it would be perfectly fine to coerce her into feeding the child. Perhaps the coercion could take place by some kind of law, or if you were a bystander there and you aren't able to feed the child, perhaps you could coerce her in some way. And maybe coercion by law would look like fines or something like that. But anyway, this looks like a case where it seems sensible that you could coerce someone into using their body to sustain the life of a infant. And that's different than the unborn child, but it's not all that far off either. So it seems to me that since that's not wildly inappropriate to coerce someone into using their body to support the life of another, you might think the same thing kind of applies in pregnancies.
So I want to pick up on this paternalism point. It seems like one reason that the state can have to prevent people from engaging in behaviors that it causes harm to others. And so in those cases where you're killing someone, we can say, well, we're entitled to prevent you from doing this because it's bad for them. But your argument's different. Your argument is it's okay to stop you from doing a thing because it's good for you when we stop you from doing it. And so that seems to open up the paternalism box. And so then the question is, what other things can we stop you from doing that would be good for you if we stop you from doing them? So, and you might think certain communities, for example, suffer from various terrible things, that they're more likely to be overweight, that they're more likely to die of certain kinds of illnesses because of their lifestyles. And so we can say, well, you don't get to go to McDonald's if you're part of X group because enough people in your group have fat fuckitis. So no McDonald's for you. And it's good for you to do this. Other people, we say it's you'd really get a benefit if we forced you into exercising, which we're going to do, at the pain of some other kind of penalty. But we're entitled to do this because it's good for you. And so then we start to get uncomfortable about the state telling us what we have to do because it's good for us. Now, if you don't think that the good for us stuff really matters and you're willing to abandon it in all those other cases, then surely you got to abandon it in this case. And then your argument just becomes abortion is murder, and so we should stop people from committing murder. But that's the highly contentious view.
So I don't want to say that the reason why the state can coerce people, women, into not having abortions is because it's good for them. That's not why the state can do that, or why. And I can't force someone to exercise because it's good for them. But I could say that if I did force someone to exercise, they would, be substantially benefited. And we can say that if the state does restrict abortion access, then there's a substantial benefit that goes to women. So yeah, I don't want to say that the reason why it's okay is because it's good, but that's a sort of nice side effect.
Perry, I am more and more convinced that your position's coherent. So in other words, if you hold all the premises are true, then the conclusion follows. So more and more you're swaying me on that. I'm trying to think whether there is a way of arguing that your position is invalid. Does the conclusion just follow from your premises if you hold all your premises are true?
I think so. I hope so. Yeah, I think so. I would hope so, because that's what I've argued.
So someone has to disagree with one of your premises.
You have listed some subsequent theses that I am committed to for this to work, but I think so. Yeah.
So I want to put some pressure on the last part of the thesis, which is this idea that we should look at something like disparate impact for certain groups. And so they claim that it's particularly good for Black women to be prevented. And so I just wonder about this idea that we should think about individual conduct and then generalize it out. So it might be good for a particular Black woman, but that seems very different for whether it's good for all Black women. I'm similarly skeptical, by the way, of a lot of policies that target on the grounds of race or any other kind of group identity. I think they're overly broad. And so if that portion of the argument is just false, then it would fail as well. And so maybe we can explore that aspect.
Right. I don't want to commit myself to any kind of political agenda. But what I'm doing in this, what I want to do here is sort of mirror this common argument that I see that abortion restrictions are bad for the group. So if that's true, if we accept that abortion restrictions would be bad for women, provided these other things hold, then I think the reverse is true if we flip the benefits in the way that I've tried to do. So as long as we're playing that game, I think we get the same conclusion. But yeah, I think it's fair to, I think that's right that at the individual level, that might not always be the case, and there might be benefits to particular individuals, but you might be hesitant to ascribe it to the whole group. But we can also think that, you know, if we're just talking about this large group of people and this benefit comes to a large portion of them, like it benefited the group in some sense. That's not how we should decide policies, I don't think, but we can still talk about whether, if that policy were enacted, whether it be good or bad for that group. Is that fair?
So no, that's where I think I struggle. So the idea that the group could be benefited or harmed seems odd to me. So you've got a whole bunch of individuals who are given a label like Black, and let's say half of those individuals get stabbed in the eye. It seems weird to say that the other half were wronged because their compatriots in this artificially created group suffered a harm. They seem to be in a neutral position. Now, you might think if you're in that group and there's a whole bunch of racist activity that your risk of harm has gone up, but assume that it was just sort of random. They lost their eyes in a hailstorm. Hard to say that the group suffered in any meaningful sense. Those that got the hell in their eyes suffered, but the other guys didn't. So I'm weary about saying that there's a benefit or a detriment to this group, like a racial group. Women, by the way, are the only relevant group who could get abortions. And so it could make sense to talk about them because they're subject to the restriction or the lack of the restriction. Black women, not necessarily so, right? They're just a subset.
Yeah, I think I agree with what you say and all of that. But I guess so I want to say something like, you know, if we're playing this game where these groups can be benefited and disadvantaged in this way, then this conclusion is going to follow. But I'm skeptical of the group stuff for the same reasons that you're talking about. But I wonder if we could just downplay the language a bit and just say something like,
you don't have to hold such a robust account of groups. So you can say this collection of individuals, if they were prevented from having abortions, all the individuals in that collection would be benefited. And it just so happens that this collection of individuals, who happen to be described often as Black women, they will have counterfactually more abortions if you don't restrict them than other collections of individuals. So it would be good for this collection of individuals. So when one particular person is restricted from having an abortion, it doesn't increase whether someone else in that collection, it doesn't increase their well-being, and it doesn't increase the collection as a whole, their well-being, because collections don't have well-being. But each individual has a higher chance of having an abortion in that collection. And so that collection has benefited more greatly than some other collection of individuals. I think you'd have to say something like that.
Yeah, that seems really plausible. I like that way of putting it. If you could write that down, and it'll just repeat that in my answer to Mark.
So to give you some background, I don't believe in the existence of groups. So on my view, you'd have to say something like that. But that does seem like a coherent view. So in other words, that's you then describing collections almost as sets. So, you're saying that this set of individuals has any one individual in the set has a greater probability of having an abortion. It's bad for them to have an abortion. And so we're doing the set are good, but the set doesn't have well-being, only each individual in that set. So maybe that addresses your problem, Mark.
Yeah, so it might be the case that the individual black woman who's prevented from having the abortion is conferred the benefit that you say she has, and so she has benefits and it is good for her. But to say that it is good for others not in that situation who happen to just share the race marker, that doesn't seem to follow.
Yeah, it doesn't follow, but it could be that those others accrue a counterfactual benefit. In other words, a risk has been taken away from them because they have a higher risk just because they're in that collection of individuals or that set of individuals, and other sets have a lower risk of having abortions.
Yes, so there's a potential benefit that could be conferred upon them would be the claim. And so that is a benefit to them because it's, if you think that potential benefits are some kind of benefit in of themselves. There's something that's sort of run through the course of our conversation, which is that part of your argument is really to shine a light on other kinds of arguments. And you've got a series of if-then statements that kind of get you to those conclusions. If you buy all the stuff, then you get there. And I suppose partly what you're doing is to say those on the pro-choice side have made strong allegations that restrictions on abortion are bad for women as a group and maybe particularly bad for black women because they've changed that first premise about whether abortion is good or bad. And maybe on the second premise, they might believe it that it is good to be prevented from doing bad things. They just don't think abortion is bad. And so the point of the argument is to partly say we really have to have a good answer to that before we can talk about the benefits. That if it turns out that abortion is either a negligible wrong or not wrong at all, well, then we go the other way. But if it really is the case that the pro-lifers are right, well, then we go the other way. But if it really is the case that, then you should go my way. It's a highly contested position.
Yes, that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
So it's very interesting. Let's say we take the position that we just don't know whether abortion is wrong or not. So we don't have God's eye perspective on this. As you say, just a bit fewer than 20% of philosophers think that abortion is very wrong. And I'm not sure what percentage think that it's permissible. I'm not sure if that means 80% think it's permissible, or maybe it's lower than that and a percentage are just not sure. I mean, I myself am uncertain. So there's edge cases on either side which make me uncertain. If we take that uncertain position, then what should we do? So if we're uncertain, then should we still implement restrictions, given that the risk of a severe wrong occurring could be prevented? Or do we not impose restrictions because that would be imposing restrictions which generally are bad? It's not good to restrict people if there's not a good reason for it.
That's hard to say what to do, whether you should, imagine that you are radically uncertain about whether infanticide is okay, and then you see someone about to throw a boulder on an infant. What do? I don't know. That's really hard to say. If we were radically uncertain, it might be best to err towards the side of freedom. But then again, seeing as how you will almost certainly be increasing the amount of goodness in the world by having a child, you might want to err on that, which itself would bring more freedom, but hard to weigh, especially as somebody who is very deeply skeptical of the state's ability to coerce people. So I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'll give you another interesting case of uncertainty. So we had Jeff Sabo on the show a while ago to talk about animal rights, and he said, one of the reasons why it's wrong to kill these animals is that they have some capacity to suffer. And so that gives us a certainty that if we, torture the chickens in the farm, that there is some suffering. He says there's other beings where we just don't know. So like with insects, it's either the case that they suffer or that they don't suffer. But we kill them en masse. So you can imagine that if you're trying to protect your crops from locusts, that you will use pesticides that will kill billions of locusts. And he thought, well, one way to think about it is to basically assign a probability value to the suffering. So you say, well, maybe it's a 1 in 1,000 chance that they have, a 1 point of disutility. And so we just divide the billion by 1,000, we get to 1,000,000, and we get 1,000,000 points of disutility. And then we compare that to the benefits, and that gives us an action guiding principle. And if, letting your crops get eaten is less than 1,000,000 points of utility, well, then, don't kill the locusts. And so you could do some similar exercise there about the fetus to say, well, we're not sure if it's wrong. Maybe there's some degree of wrongness. And so we come up with a regime that either says you can perform abortions at these stages, or we, restrict a certain portion of them. You're only allowed X number of abortions in a year. But as you point out, who imposes the rule seems to matter. So if you're skeptical of state authority, being told by daddy government what you're allowed to do with your own body seems kind of pretty bad, especially under conditions of uncertainty. And you might say, well, then you should leave it up to me. If it's an uncertain question, I'll be the decider as opposed to you.
So there's two issues there. One is like, if we take into account like potential suffering and also potential benefits, we can sort of do a decision theoretic analysis. If we do that, it seems very likely that someone shouldn't have an abortion, right? Because you're producing more happy humans, which is a ton of happiness. So that's going to outweigh any downsides that come from that. The other issue, and so I think that if we're playing that game, then we probably should restrict abortion access then, because it produces more happy humans. But on the other point of being skeptical about the government being the one implementing these restrictions, especially in cases of extreme uncertainty. Well, that might be a problem, but now let me think about the infant case again, where suppose that we were radically uncertain about whether infanticide is wrong, and you see somebody about to throw a rock on an infant. I actually think you should stop the person from throwing the rock, just given what's at stake. You're just preventing you are taking away from their freedom a little bit, but the upshot is significant. The risk is too great to allow that person that kind of freedom. So in that case, it seems that maybe coercion from the state would be right. And if not from the state, it seems that other people could permissibly coerce. And what would the coercion look like? I don't know. I'm skeptical. I wouldn't want to throw people in cages for this. But maybe fine. I don't have a fully worked out, good, perfect coercive law, but something like fines or something.
Here's a nice way of cashing out your thought experiment of infanticide. The way you've phrased it now, it's going to support the position that you should stop the person from throwing the boulder on the child, just because we have such strong intuitions, and you're not giving a reason why we might be uncertain. So here's a reason why we might be uncertain. We happen to live in a society of time travelers, and people can go back and forth in time, or at least forwards in time in this case, and they can go forwards in time and see what people are going to do with their lives. We also happen to live in a world where some gene mutation has occurred recently because of whatever reason, and there's a lot of little Hitlers that are born. It's maybe two and three people, and so there's all these time travelers that are going forward in time. They're seeing little Hitlers being born. They come back and they find some boulders and they squash them, right? And so, you are destroying a life before that person has done anything wrong, which seems like a bad thing to do, but you could prevent a lot of suffering. So we're now in a situation where there's radical uncertainty, perhaps because time is also not deterministic. And so that person who's about to throw the boulder went forward to a possible future, but maybe not the only future, where this little kid turned into a Hitler, but it's still possible that they could be turned around and not, they could be reformed. So now there's massive uncertainty. There's radical uncertainty about the utility of throwing the boulder on the kid. Should we now outlaw it or not? Would your conclusion still follow?
So there's just Hitlers everywhere. We're not sure which ones are Hitler and which ones aren't. That makes it a lot less clear. But in cases of typical abortions in right now in our world, that's not the case. So even though there could be situations in which we don't know whether we ought to do these restrictions or enact these restrictions, that doesn't seem to be our world, at least.
Well, that's not the equivalent. So I'm not saying these kids are going to grow up to be little Hitlers. The uncertainty in the one case is about whether they're going to grow up to be Hitlers. The uncertainty in the other is whether they're persons at all. The metaphysical question is uncertain. Are they just a bunch of cells? Is it equivalent to driving your car over a piece of meat that was alive a second ago? So that's the uncertainty, not their future moral actions.
Okay, yeah. In that case, I still think, like, if you really don't know, well, maybe I'm misunderstanding the thought experiment, because I thought the point was about you don't know whether it's Hitler. But if we're reverting back to the point of my original one, where it's like you don't know whether or not it's wrong to kill an infant, I think it's given the stakes, you want to err on the side of caution there.
So I suppose Jason is getting at something, which is we hold a deeply seated belief about babies, which is that it's wrong to murder them. And so it's hard for us to conceive of a world in which it would be acceptable. And so that skews our intuitions. And so we want to be in a situation where we're just not sure. Let's think a little bit about pre-babies. So imagine that you've got someone who's going to be performing in vitro fertilization, and they're carrying some embryos, and they're on their way to do it. And but it's a busy day, so they're also carrying a newborn baby in the other hand, and they in a rush, and they slip, and either the two zygotes are going to crash to the floor and perish, or the newborn baby is going to crash to the floor. And I say to you, you get a role in deciding which one survives. Which one do you pick?
So I think that's a hard case, because I don't think our intuitions are terribly good at tracking in this context, because embryos just don't look and move and act like us. So there's a lot that's hard to get us to, if they are persons, it's hard for us to register that. But so maybe this is a good case, because if we're uncertain about that. Yeah, I don't know what to think about those cases. But one reason, so that doesn't tell us about the moral status or what we ought to do, is just like, you want to prevent this pain. If the embryos fall, they're going to have a painless death. But if a baby falls, it's going to experience a lot of pain. It also has a lot of connections and family members, and probably not friends because it's a baby, but there's going to be a lot of other external ramifications that are bummers that you'd want to avoid. So when we do it that way, we just look at we might think that both we might even think embryos are persons, and that would be wrong to let them fall. But there might be other reasons you might have for saving the baby there.
So I think that's useful. So as you say, the baby, we have some good reasons to think has an elevated status. And maybe you say it's tough because it's 2-1. I wonder how many embryos I could add into that petri dish before you start to think, okay, well, now we must let the baby die. Also, if you just think about the nature of in vitro, it's standard practice to insert a large number of zygotes with an expectation that a lot of them will perish. And so you might think, if these things are valuable in some sense, in vitro fertilization is completely and utterly unacceptable. That if we're putting in 4 with the expectation that one will survive, you're bringing beings into the world to sacrifice them for the benefit of some other being. We definitely wouldn't tolerate that in the baby's case. But it seems like you're willing to tolerate it, or most people are willing to tolerate it in the zygote's case. So it seems to put them in a very different moral category. And if we're accepting they're in a different moral category, then we're in much more shaky territory about the certainty question.
Well, I'm deeply skeptical about our intuitions in this case, because, like I said, this it doesn't look like us, and it doesn't trigger the same processes in the brain that we might that require for us to attribute agency to something. And if we don't think of something as an agent, we don't typically think of it as a person. So I'm deeply suspicious of our intuitions in these cases. So I don't give them much weight here at all, really. And then if we really want to make it analogous, like, so we have a baby in one hand, and then if we have the embryos, but suppose that if we want to make the baby and the embryos on a par here, we'd have to say, like, the baby, if it survives and you catch it, it will need to be hooked up to somebody for 9 months. And we're not sure if anyone will actually agree to be hooked up to it. It's possible, but unlikely. And during the process, there's a significant chance it'll die, the same significant chance that embryos have of not making it, right? And when we do that, when we say the baby is, 1, needs to be hooked up, 2, probably won't get hooked up, 3, and if it does get hooked up, it very well could die, then it's a lot less clear whether you ought to save the baby or the embryos. So that's another reason I'm deeply suspicious about these cases and what they tell us.
Well, Perry, I want to say this has been an absolutely delightful conversation. It's a nice, spicy topic. So spicy, in fact, from what I gather, that the detailed paper you've written on this topic is in suspended animation. It is like a zygote that has been stuck in the freezer, and that many people won't get a chance to read in a journal unless the forces of free speech prevail. If you'd like to tell us more about that, I'd be interested to hear.
Sure. So this is a paper I wrote called Abortion Restrictions Are Good for Black Women, and it got accepted at the new bioethics after being revised a couple of times. And then I posted a penultimate draft of it online after it had been accepted. And then a very angry person on Twitter with lots of followers posted it and said that the paper was racist and sexist. But it's not clear that the person actually read the paper. I think that she read the title and then maybe part of the abstract and got upset and asked to speak to the manager, quite literally, on Twitter. There's a name for people who ask to speak to the manager, but I can't quite remember it. And then, so the new bioethics has now put it on hold, pending a review by the editor or something like that. They have, I don't know what's going to happen. That was about, maybe it was like 6 weeks ago. But there were a lot of very angry people on Twitter. A lot of people were upset. And, you know, academics, especially the ones on Twitter, are alarmingly fragile. It's quite shocking what can set them off. They probably don't have any real problems if some academic paper upsets them. But, you know, I hope that these people are sort of able to get the help that they need.
Well, Perry, I think you've probably gathered that Mark and I both disagree with your position for various reasons. I was saying to Mark, we've never had a guest on the show that both of us agree with. But I think it's very important that people are allowed academic free speech and free speech generally, and allowed to hold their views and discuss them. And I think that your position is very interesting. As I said, it's very bold, and I love bold positions. And thank you for coming on the show and exploring it with us. And thank you for parrying all of our objections.